Krishna, we are here in San Diego with a few devotees. Markandeya Taruni, who just arrived from Israel. Krishna Gana from Australia. And today's Bhaktivinoda Thakur's appearance day, so we're going to sing that song for Bhaktivinoda Thakur and then speak about him. So, here we go. Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharine Nirvisesha Yavadi Pasatyadesha Dharine Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Jai Advaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gauravaranga Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Rama, Hare Rama, Rama, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Rama. Krishna. So now we're going to speak about Bhaktivinoda Thakura. That's the royal we. So stay tuned here. I'm going to go over to my other sitting place. Have me a pillow for this pillow cushion. So, first I'm going to translate that song for you, that verse that we sing to Bhaktivinoda Thakura. Namo Bhaktivinodaya Satchidananda Namine Gauda Shakti Swarupaya Rupanuga Varayate. This means, of course, I bow to Bhaktivinoda, Namo Bhaktivinodaya Satchidananda Namine, who is known as Satchidananda. Sat means eternal, Chit means full of knowledge, and Ananda means blissful or bliss. So Bhaktivinoda Thakura is called Satchidananda because he has realized his eternal form, his eternal identity as Satchidananda, eternal, blissful, full of knowledge, as a loving servant of Krishna. So Namo Bhaktivinodaya Satchidananda Namine Gauda Shakti Swarupaya. He's the Swarupa, or the very form of, the personification of Lord Chaitanya's power, Lord Chaitanya's potency, Gauda Shakti Swarupa. So Gauda Shakti Swarupaya Rupanuga Varayate, and the best of the followers of Rupa Goswami. We are called, or we try to be, Rupanuga. Anu in Sanskrit means follow, and ga means to go, so anuga means a follower. A follower, anuga. So there's Rupa, anuga, follower of Rupa Goswami, Rupa anuga. And so why Rupa? Because, of course, Lord Chaitanya had many great devotees. Rupa Goswami was, of course, the senior, actually not senior, his older brother Sanatan was older, but he was considered sort of the leader of the six Goswamis. And they really established you could say philosophically Lord Chaitanya's movement. Of course, Lord Chaitanya himself engaged in famous philosophical debates with Prakashananda Saraswati and his Mayavadi sannyasis, with Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, and with others. He even had a little debate with the Qazi in Navadvip, but Rupa Goswami systematized everything. And of course, then also Jiva Goswami, his nephew, in books like Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, and established really the, you could say, the philosophy of Krishna consciousness as we understand it. And of course, he learned directly from Lord Chaitanya. So the Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita is very important, because it is not only a, you could say it's a biography of Lord Chaitanya's activities, it's also an intellectual biography, and traces actually Lord Chaitanya's teachings and gives all the scriptural evidence. So Rupa Goswami was really a leader among the followers of Lord Chaitanya, those who were actively establishing his institution. Interestingly, the intimate associates who were in Jagannath Puri with Lord Chaitanya the last 6 years of his, no, last actually 18 years. He was 24 years in Navadvip, then 6 years traveling, then 18 years based in Jagannath Puri. And so those devotees, of course, were especially engaged in serving the Lord. And interestingly, even though Lord Chaitanya lived in Jagannath Puri 18 of his last 24 years that he spent in his manifest pastimes on this planet, Jagannath Puri did not become a center for Lord Chaitanya's movement. There is an ISKCON center there, and of course devotees go there, but it's not Vrindavan. And so Vrindavan is much more, and of course Mayapur, Vrindavan and Mayapur. Vrindavan really is the most famous pilgrimage place in the world in general among Lord Chaitanya's followers, and the 6 Goswamis were there. And because Lord Chaitanya came as an incarnation, or just as Krishna himself, Lord Chaitanya came to point to Krishna. Krishna sort of pointed at himself. Like if you read Bhagavad Gita, Krishna is saying, it's actually about me. And so Krishna is presenting himself as the Supreme Lord, as the source of everything. And in the Bhagavad Gita, it's the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna is talking, explaining himself, that he's God and what that means to be God and who we are and so on. So Krishna came, as Kunti says in her prayers, that in the future people will talk about what you're doing now. You're coming now to perform pastimes that people will, for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, people will talk about what you've done. And so Lord Chaitanya, of course, his pastimes are important, but Lord Chaitanya is Krishna, but coming as a devotee of Krishna and trying to direct our attention to Krishna. And so it's interesting how the 6 Goswamis, of course, were based in Vrindavan. Lord Chaitanya assigned them there. They were sent to Vrindavan. They excavated the holy places that people now visit. And they wrote very important books. And so Bhaktivinoda Thakur is called Rupa Nuga Varayate. Vara means the best or excellent. And so he's called the best of the followers of Rupa Goswami. So that's why I'm explaining Rupa Goswami, because Bhaktivinoda Thakur is explained. Interestingly, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, in this verse to him, is glorified in relation to 2 people. He's called the Swarupa, or the personification of Gaurav, Lord Chaitanya himself, and he's called the best follower of Rupa Goswami. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur sort of defined, or he's explained in terms of his relationship to these 2 people. Lord Chaitanya being God, and then Rupa Goswami showing exactly how to follow Lord Chaitanya. And so I'll tell a personal story, if I'm allowed to do that. And I've always had a special, I guess you'd call it attraction to Bhaktivinoda Thakur. When the first temple I ever visited, the first ISKCON temple, was in Los Angeles, not the present temple at Watsika, but the older one in La Cienega Boulevard, which I believe they were renting. I don't remember, but it was on La Cienega Boulevard, and not too far from the present temple, maybe a mile or 2. So in those days, it was an old church, and in the sanctuary room, the room of worship, where they have a little stage, they had an altar, and it was very interesting how the Hare Krishna movement was back then. They had a very large, I guess you call it Indian rug or Persian rug on the floor. And because Prabhupada was doing the Krishna book then, he was actually, when I first started visiting the LA temple, Prabhupada was actually unknown to me, living a few blocks away from me in Beverly Hills. I had no idea. And he was writing the Krishna book. And so the ISKCON artists, ISKCON Press, this was before VVT, ISKCON Press was very busy painting pictures for the Krishna book that would be coming out. And so they had a lot of these pictures and other pictures also, around the walls, around 3 walls of the temple room. Of course, the 4th wall was the altar in the front. And so devotees in those days during kirtan, I was just a guest there, they would, there was no men's side or women's side back then. And so all the devotees together, they would circumambulate the temple, but around the perimeter, the inside perimeter of the temple, chanting and just meditating on the pictures. And so we just go around and around the temple room, looking at the pictures and chanting. And that was kirtan in those days. So I remember when I came in front of the altar, which I did about approximately every 2 minutes as we were going around. But I don't even know what an altar was. I didn't really come from a religion where you had altars with pictures and everything. But I remember that what first caught my eye on the altar, what first really struck me, was the picture of Bhaktivinoda Thakura. And that was almost the first experience I had in this life, a feeling that I had a spiritual connection that was could not be explained in terms of material psychology. That was a spiritual experience, if I can use those words. And of course, then soon after that, Krishna just revealed to me, I guess you could say, just in my heart. It was just a very clear revelation. I didn't question it. Just seemed like, yeah, of course. And that was that Prabhupada is your eternal spiritual master. And it was, I just thought, it was almost like somebody telling me what time it was, in the sense that it was so uncontroversial and not something I would question or worry about. It's just, okay, that's obvious. So, but I remember that my first actual experience was, I remember that going by the altar, not even knowing, I didn't have the concept of altar in my mind, and just seeing Bhaktivinoda and just feeling that somehow he knew that I was looking at him and that there was a connection there. And so ever since then, Bhaktivinoda, I think for many, many devotees, or certainly for me, is a very, very attractive figure. He was, among the followers of Lord Chaitanya, you could say he was really the first modern acharya. Because if you look at, some of the Vaishnavas before that, they might have been in the 19th century, they might have been in the 11th century. I mean, in terms of how they lived and everything, they were just sort of in this timeless culture. But in terms of an acharya who really very consciously positioned himself in the modern world, even as he was engaged in purely worshiping Krishna and Lord Chaitanya, but very consciously and very intentionally placed himself in the modern world. That was Bhaktivinoda Thakura. And so Bhaktivinoda Thakura really is the beginning of modern Gaudiya Vaishnavism. He's really the beginning of that. And another thing which I find very, very interesting about Bhaktivinoda is that he was a true intellectual, a classical intellectual. Nowadays, there are very few intellectuals. They're kind of people that scream at other people that don't agree with them, and they're, but in terms of people that are really well-rounded, well-read, thoughtful intellectuals, there aren't that many nowadays. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur was definitely one. Bhaktivinoda Thakur, as all the serious biographies explain, belonged to a very important group of people in British India called the Bhadralok. And Bhadralok is sort of a translation into Bengali. It's Sanskrit Bengali. I mean, it's Bengali, which is basically just Sanskrit words. It's a translation of an important English term, which was good society. Because in England at the time, or in Europe at the time, there was a real distinction and boundary between, let's say, common people, what we might call with great affection Shudras, and and um, and the more educated, higher class people, not just nobles, not titled nobles, or just necessarily people who were very rich. People who were just educated, good educated people who had serious moral standards. It included a moral dimension, people who were decent, who followed the moral rules, which were basically our principles without the vegetarian thing. So, but otherwise, in terms of sexual mores and gambling and drinking, they were, pretty much like that. And so those respectable men and women who, again, were educated and decent, they would refer to them as good society. There's a line, actually, in a Jane Austen novel called Sensibility, where Mrs. Jennings is describing to the heroine of the story what happened to this very unfortunate girl who was exploited by her guardian, and basically her life was ruined. And so the lady says she was lost to all good society. So the Bengali translation of good society is Bhadralok. And the term in India, especially West Bengal, or Bengal in those days, it wasn't really divided so much, because the British had their capital up until, I don't know, mid 1800s, they had their capital in Bengal. And Bengal is very much the intellectual and cultural center of, in addition to being the political center of British India. So the Bhadralok, that term was used more specifically in India to refer, especially in West Bengal or Bengal, to intelligent, educated Bengalis, including many younger ones, who were intellectually sophisticated, who were well read in the Western sense, who had either formally or the equivalent of a Western education, and who were really up on things, who could, go eye to eye with the Western intellectuals, many of whom were ministers, because in the Protestant religions, including the Church of England, you had to really be educated to be a minister. And so these preachers were coming to India from Europe, and especially from Britain, and they were educated people. And they weren't just, it wasn't like, the Spanish approach to Latin America, like you could convert or die a horrible death, or perhaps both, we might actually offer you both. But the British, it was very different. If you compare the Spanish in the Western Hemisphere and the Americas and the British in India, despite some really bad things British did, it's very, very different. They're actually trying to persuade Hindus, and they're trying to persuade the educated newer generations, and they have debates and they discuss things, and you have British people who become great Sanskrit scholars and write the dictionaries that we still use and the grammar books and so on. And so it was very interesting. I consider that time, the time that Bhaktivinoda Thakura lived in, I think intellectually is probably one of the most interesting times in modern history. The age we live in now is intellectually not at all interesting, for the simple reason that there are very few real intellectuals. There are propagandists in the universities for left-wing causes and things like that. But in terms of real intellectuals who are, because what was interesting about this intellectual period that Bhaktivinoda very actively participated in. So to understand Bhaktivinoda Thakur, you really have to understand this historical context, because that's the world he lived in and he was very active in. That was his quote unquote his preaching field. And so most of the intellectuals on both sides were actually religious. They're religious. And so it was given that there's a God and that God has certain features, such as being all powerful and all knowing and all good. And so now, what are the implications of that? If you accept that there's a triple O God, omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, if you accept that there's a triple O God, then what does that mean? Does that suggest that maybe Krishna is God? Does it suggest Krishna is not God? What about Jesus? And there are, major philosophical problems with Christian doctrine. I mean, catastrophic theological problems actually with Christian, which I won't go into now. But so they were discussing all these things. These people were very sophisticated, and Bhaktivinoda was right there with them. He read all the books they read, and he knew history. He knew philosophy. I mean, he was right up there, discussing. Consider a person, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, who is so brilliant that he writes poetry in 3 languages. I mean, it's one thing to know how to order your lunch in several languages, or you can have a simple conversation or something like that. But to write poetry, because poetry is it's kind of very refined language. That's what poetry is. It's you could say the most refined language. So to write serious poetry, good poetry in 3 languages, which were Bengali, Sanskrit, and English, is something. Bhaktivinoda Thakur is very concerned to save the Western world. This concern with, this awareness of the Western world, which Bhaktivinoda was keenly aware of. I mean, he lived really in a hybrid world. He lived, you could say, in the Western world intellectually as much, just as he lived in an Indian world. I mean, ultimately, of course, he lived in Krishna consciousness, but in terms of worldly culture, he was as Western as he was Bengali. And he's the one that first sent one of our books to a Western university. And he's very concerned to bring this mission around the world, especially the Western people. He's very concerned. He's really focused on it. And another very interesting thing about Bhaktivinoda Thakur, which is not generally known, but which I discovered doing my research for my little hobby, which is Krishna West, is that Bhaktivinoda Thakur and his son, Bhaktisiddhanta, together, they actually wrote a book together, and they were severe critics of sort of blind, ritualistic religious institutions. And they didn't just mean of other religions. They also meant Vaishnava institutions. And they were, really heavy criticism. For example, Bhaktivinoda Thakur and his son say the worst kind of Vaishnava who thinks that another Vaishnava is someone that dresses a certain way or wears a certain kind of tilak, and to think that that's what makes you a devotee is the worst kind of Vaishnavism. They actually say that. And they talk about the tendency. It's very interesting because if you look, just take a step back and look at a religion, what happens to a religious institution over time. And of course, often spiritual movements begin with very high hopes and idealism, and often with someone who's perceived to be a pure spiritual leader, as in the case of ISKCON, or the Gaudiya Math with Bhaktisiddhanta, or Bhaktivinoda Thakur and his mission. And so what you have is, inevitably, if you have a powerful acharya or preacher in any religion, and people come, and more people come, and at a certain point you have to organize, otherwise it's just chaos. I mean, there's just like 3 people hanging out. Yeah, let's read the Bhagavatam tonight. You don't need an institution. But if you've got 300 people, it's like, how do you even feed them unless you have some kind of management? I mean, you just have to organize things. How do you engage people? And so you have this this ironic dynamic in the material world that the more you have a pure leader, the more you get an institution, and the more you get an institution, the more you tend to forget the original purity. And so it's sort of this thing that plays against itself. And you see it throughout history in all religions. So then what happens is you get people who are good managers, but not necessarily great, not necessarily pure souls, but they rise to positions of leadership in religious institutions. And actually, I'm not saying that every leader of a religious institution is just some kind of clever bureaucrat that's not really spiritual. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that, yeah, some of them are. Some of them really are not that spiritual, but they follow the basic principles, and they kind of, either they're good managers or just they convince other people they are, and then once they get power, you can't get rid of them. And so in every religious institution, you get a certain number of people who are better at management than they are at love of God. And then what happens over time? So to make a long story short, to keep a spiritual institution truly spiritual, and not just, and not to have at least some leaders, I don't mean all leaders, some leaders who are really ambitious and attached to their positions and really kind of by nature like to tell other people what to do, but they justify it all by using words like parampara, and you can't make spiritual advancement unless you do what I say, and Prabhupada said you should follow me, and so you get that. Again, I'm not saying all leaders are like that. I'm not even saying most leaders are like that, but are some leaders like that? Oh my God. I mean, anyone in Hare Krishna movement knows the answer to that one. So Bhaktivinoda, the reason I'm bringing this up is that Bhaktivinoda and his son, Bhaktisiddhanta, his great son, really criticize these things. They criticize, and it's not only leaders, it's not just about leaders. It's about the fact that until we become really pure souls, like pure souls, we still have material desires. And in the most general sense, you could say it's the desire to lord it over in various ways. I mean, after all, what is lust but a desire to lord it over another person by sex pleasure, or getting some position? Getting money is another way to lord it over. Again, I'm not saying everyone who has a position or money is like this, but some people are. Some people certainly are. And so not only leaders, I mean, I don't want to talk about leaders now, but just regular devotees. It's like, if you join the Hare Krishna, I'm using the Hare Krishna movement because I know something about it, but it's the same in any religion. It's not just the Hare Krishna movement. It's any religious organization where people themselves, because we are working towards spiritual liberation. We may not be completely there yet. And therefore, let's say the average devotee still has some desire to lord it over. And it's very common to dovetail that desire by thinking you're better than non-devotees. It's sort of it's a delicate thing, because unless you think it's better to be a devotee than a non-devotee, why would you be a devotee? And so you have to really be convinced that there are significant advantages for you in being a devotee and not giving up your spiritual practice. If you didn't think that, you wouldn't have a spiritual practice. So it's this delicate thing where you really are convinced that you have a better life by practicing Krishna consciousness and all that, and yet not falling into the trap of thinking that I'm better than other people who are not practicing. I'm better than them. Not just that I'm more fortunate, but I'm actually better than them. And then you get a class of devotees. And again, Bhaktivinoda Thakura talks about this. This is not me, it's Bhaktivinoda Thakura, who want to, what's the word? Officialize. They want to really show the world that they're better. And so therefore they adopt a certain special kind of dress, or they have, they have certain markings, and these become, for some devotees, symbols of their superiority. Because I'm better than a karmi, a jnani, a yogi, or whoever. And so, of course, it's possible to use these things just in a humble mood of, someone may think that it's devotional dress. They may think that. But apart from that, it's possible to really embrace these things as a sign of one's superiority. Like we're different than them and we're better than them. And Bhaktivinoda heavily criticizes this. And you can fall into this illusion, which Bhaktivinoda criticizes, of thinking that the greater you are as a Vaishnava, the more different you are from non-Vaishnavas. And so you get this consciousness where we have to really make clear to ourselves and to the world that we're different. We're not you. We're a different group. We're different people. And we're not like you. And what's interesting is that according to our philosophy, the more one wants to do that, the more one is actually not advanced in a neophyte. Because if you look at the third class, second class, first class devotee, third class devotee can't even make friendship with devotees, doesn't really care about anyone, except goes and worships the deity. And then a second class devotee actually makes friendship with devotees and cares about non-devotees. A second class devotee preaches because a second class devotee cares about other people, cares about them, feels empathy for them. And of course, you can't feel empathy for someone unless in some way you identify with them. So someone, let's say a devotee lacking empathy, a devotee who glories in being different from the karmis, just really, glories in it, does everything that the person does everything they possibly can in terms of the way they dress, the way they do everything to really distinguish themselves from non-devotees. And they may even go out and preach or sell books, but really with the spirit of conquering the world, with the spirit of subjugating people, with the spirit of, or just, I sell a lot of Prabhupada's books, so I'm a great devotee. Again, I don't mean that all or most book distributors have that mundane motivation, but some people do. And so you can actually have a movement where it looks like you're really preaching, but there's a tremendous amount of vanity. There's an overwhelming sense of superiority. And one can even go out and sell books and do other things as a sign of that I'm a great devotee. I'm a great devotee because I sold a lot of books. So even things which look like compassionate preaching activities, in some cases, can be just another manifestation of one's arrogance. And I remember that. I mean, we had a problem. Again, there, many devotees sell books, are really good devotees. But I remember when I was GBC in Latin America and other places, actually, it wasn't just my zone. There was a real problem in ISKCON because you get these devotees who go out and sell huge numbers of books and they get all kinds of glory and fame and people would praise them. But then when some of the people that bought books came to the temple, you couldn't find anyone to preach them. That, you have a whole temple where almost everybody in the temple is a book distributor, and you can't find anyone that really wants to preach to guests when they come. And so what does that tell you? It tells you that it's possible, again, I'm not saying all or most, but it's possible for someone to go out and do book distribution as a demonstration of their advanced status, that I'm really devoted to Prabhupada. And there may not be the true compassion, because we know, we've seen people who are so-called leaders, who are big book distributors, who just aren't even nice people. I mean, again, I don't say all or most, I keep saying that, but there definitely are people who are supposed to be leaders in a spiritual movement, and they're really not even nice people. I mean, you really would not want to hang around with these people. They're just not nice. And so when we talk about the real Madhyamadikari, the real second-class devotee, we're talking about someone who doesn't just make a show of, I sold lots of books, or, you know, I organized this and that program, but someone that really cares about other people, someone that truly, deeply cares about other people and does whatever they have to do to help those people feel comfortable in Krishna consciousness. And then, of course, you get the Paramahamsa, or the Uttam Adhikari. And the Uttam Adhikari, as Prabhupada always explained, sees everyone as a devotee of Krishna. In other words, as you advance, your powers of empathy increase. You see less and less difference between yourself and other people. It's the neophyte who is threatened by the world, because the neophyte, you know, in a moment could just kind of flip and go back to the material world. And so, you know, the neophyte may want to really kind of hide from the non-devotees, or as some devotees say, when I go out in public, you know, I need to dress in, you know, sort of an exotic way as a devotee, because when people look at me as being very different, I need that. I need that just to remind myself that I'm different. And so, okay, you know, whatever it takes. But I mean, clearly it's not an advanced position. Unless people are staring at me, you know, I will forget who I am. Clearly not an advanced position. But the Uttam Adhikari is sees everyone else serving Krishna and kind of like, I'm not doing that much. And so the more you advance in Krishna consciousness, the less difference you see between yourself and others. And at the same time, you're very strict in your own Krishna consciousness. You can be strict in your own Krishna consciousness without thinking you're better than other people, without having to build high cultural walls between you and other people, so that you're not threatened. You know, you're not in danger of slipping back into your old life. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur talks a lot about these things. I'm mentioning these things today on his appearance day because he talks a lot about this. For one thing, because he's very concerned about preaching in the West, and he's very concerned to make Krishna consciousness come easy for Western people. So is Lord Chaitanya's movement just, you know, making continual progress? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, in terms of really learning how to just integrate oneself in the educated world without losing one's own Krishna consciousness, and powerfully preaching, I think there's things we really need to learn from Bhaktivinoda today. There are certain things that he preached very strongly that I think we really need to learn or relearn and apply. So that was Bhaktivinoda Thakur. He was, of course, a magistrate. He was a highly respectable person in his own society, both in the regular society. He was very respected among the Vaishnavas. He had a son who was a great devotee of Bhaktisiddhanta, and of course, Gaur Kishore is his disciple. And he's really the founder of modern Gaudiya Vaishnavism. He's the founder of modern Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And he took a lot of important steps that paved the way, that really cleared the path for his son, Bhaktisiddhanta, and our Prabhupada. So it's almost inconceivable, a Hare Krishna movement in the modern sense without Bhaktivinoda Thakura. So let me see really quickly here if anyone asked any questions. Make sure when you write down your questions, you put in your credit card number. Just kidding. That was a joke. What about, this is very interesting. What about us that don't fit in anywhere? Maybe karmis think we are odd, and the other devotees judge the way we preach. How do we deal with that pressure? How do we associate when our local association is maybe not so nice people, to use your word? Karmis think we're odd. I think that would only be true if you live in a very strange place. I mean, I think it's possible to be a good devotee and a Krishna conscious preacher and not be seen by everyone around you as strange. So I think there's a way to, I mean, people obviously sooner or later will figure out you're different. And people, they may have this or that opinion about Gaudiya Vaishnavism, but I think the real challenge for us is to find a way to be good devotees, serious practitioners, and at the same time make people comfortable with us and just fit in. And I think there are devotees that are doing that, and so it is possible. Okay, thank you all very much for listening, and all glories to Bhaktivinoda Thakura, and hope to see you all soon. Hare Krishna.